The email arrived at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Subject line, meeting request, urgent. I knew what it meant before I opened it. These things happen in corporate environments, especially when you've been doing your job too well for too long. Director Harrison wanted to see me in his office at 4:30 p.m. No agenda provided. No context given. Just that clinical corporate politeness that signals something unpleasant is about to unfold. I had been expecting this conversation for weeks, ever since I'd submitted my findings about the Meridian Project discrepancies. The thing about working in financial risk assessment for 12 years is that you develop an instinct for patterns. Numbers tell stories, and I'd been reading the same story for months. The Meridian Project, our company's flagship software implementation, was hemorrhaging money through a series of procurement decisions that made absolutely no sense from a cost-benefit perspective. Someone was either remarkably incompetent or remarkably dishonest, and the financial exposure was approaching catastrophic levels. I had documented everything, every inflated vendor contract, every unnecessary licensing agreement, every consultant fee that seemed to multiply like bacteria in a petri dish. The total potential loss was $1.2 million, and that was conservative. I'd spent 3 months building an airtight case, complete with alternative vendor proposals that would have saved the company nearly 60% on implementation costs. My report was comprehensive, 37 pages of detailed analysis, supporting documentation, and recommended corrective actions. I'd even included a timeline for implementation that would minimize disruption to ongoing operations. It was the kind of work that had earned me recognition in previous roles, the kind of thoroughness that had saved my previous employers millions in avoided losses. Harrison's office occupied a corner of the 23rd floor, with windows that offered a commanding view of the city skyline. The irony wasn't lost on me that someone who couldn't see obvious financial problems had been given the best vantage point in the building. He was sitting behind his mahogany desk when I arrived, my report open in front of him like evidence in a trial. The conversation lasted exactly 11 minutes. I know because I checked my watch when I left. Harrison informed me that my analysis of the Meridian Project was appreciated, but that I had overstepped my authority by conducting such an extensive investigation without explicit approval. He used the word overstepping 3 times during our brief exchange, as if repetition would somehow make the accusation more valid. The decision had been made, he explained, to restructure the risk assessment department. My position was being eliminated as part of a broader efficiency initiative. The company was moving toward a more streamlined approach to financial oversight, one that would rely more heavily on automated systems and less on what he termed subjective analysis. I would receive a generous severance package, 3 months of salary plus benefits, a glowing letter of recommendation that would emphasize my attention to detail and dedication to the company's best interests. The transition would be handled discreetly, with my departure scheduled for the end of the month. 2 weeks' notice, professionally delivered, with all the courtesy that corporate protocols demanded. Harrison seemed genuinely convinced that he was handling the situation with appropriate sensitivity. He even mentioned that he hoped I would consider the company a positive reference for future opportunities. I thanked him for his time and asked if there were any questions about my ongoing projects. He assured me that the remaining team members would be able to handle the transition smoothly. The Meridian Project would continue as planned, with oversight transferred to the accounting department, which had already signed off on the existing vendor agreements. Walking back to my office, I felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite satisfaction. It was more like the recognition of a pattern completing itself. I had seen this before in other organizations, the institutional allergic reaction to inconvenient truths. Companies that hired expertise and then fired it when it became too expensive or too uncomfortable to maintain. My office was on the 19th floor, a modest space with a desk, 2 chairs, and a window that looked out onto the parking structure. I'd worked there for 4 years, long enough to accumulate the usual collection of office supplies, reference materials, and personal items that mark a professional territory. The plant in the corner was a spider plant that had survived 3 office relocations and seemed determined to outlast whatever corporate restructuring came next. I spent the remainder of the afternoon organizing my files and preparing transition documents for my replacement, whoever that might be. The Meridian Project documentation was particularly extensive. I had copies of every contract, every invoice, every email exchange that had led to my conclusions about the financial irregularities. Standard practice for any risk assessment professional worth their salary. The interesting thing about documentation is that it serves multiple purposes It protects the organization from legal liability. It provides a clear record of decision-making processes. And it creates a paper trail that can be extremely valuable when circumstances change unexpectedly. I had been careful to ensure that all my documentation was comprehensive and properly archived. Every analysis had been backed up in multiple formats and stored in secure locations. The original files remained on the company servers, of course, but I had maintained personal copies of all the research and supporting materials that I had gathered independently. This wasn't corporate espionage or data theft. This was basic professional diligence. Any competent risk assessment professional maintains copies of their work, both for portfolio purposes and for potential legal protection. The financial services industry is heavily regulated, and professionals who fail to maintain proper documentation can find themselves facing serious legal consequences. That evening, I reviewed my files at home. The Meridian Project documentation filled 3 binders and several digital folders. The pattern of financial irregularities was even more obvious when viewed in aggregate. Vendor contracts that had been awarded without competitive bidding. Licensing agreements that included services the company would never use. Consultant fees that had escalated far beyond the original project scope. The most egregious example was the primary software vendor, Apex Solutions. Their initial proposal had been competitive, roughly in line with industry standards for a project of this scope. But the contract that had been signed included a series of amendments and addendums that had nearly doubled the total cost. Each amendment had been presented as a necessary adjustment to meet changing requirements. But the cumulative effect was a massive cost overrun. I had identified 3 alternative vendors who could have provided equivalent services at significant savings. DataCore Systems could have handled the implementation for 40% less than the amended Apex contract. Meridian Technologies, despite the naming coincidence, had submitted a proposal that was 35% below the final Apex pricing. Either option would have saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars, but these alternatives had been dismissed during the vendor selection process. The decision-making committee, chaired by Harrison, had determined that Apex Solutions offered superior value despite the higher cost. The reasoning, documented in meeting minutes that I had obtained through normal channels, focused on Apex's established relationship with the company and their proven track record with similar implementations. What the committee had failed to consider was that Apex's previous work for the company had been consistently over budget and behind schedule. Their track record was proof of expensive mediocrity, not superior value. But pointing out these inconvenient facts had apparently constituted overstepping my authority. The following morning, I began my final 2 weeks with the company. Standard transition protocols applied. I would complete any urgent analysis work, prepare comprehensive handover documentation, and ensure that ongoing projects could continue without interruption. The company's interest would be protected, even as my own employment was being terminated. My colleagues in the risk assessment department reacted to the news with varying degrees of surprise and concern. Sarah Chen, who had worked with me on several major projects, seemed genuinely shocked. She had assumed that my work on the Meridian project would result in recognition, not termination. The analysis had been exactly the kind of thorough investigation that the company claimed to value. Marcus Torres, our department's senior analyst, was more philosophical. He had seen similar situations before, he told me. Companies that brought in expertise and then discovered that expertise could be inconvenient. It was part of the cyclical nature of corporate decision-making. Cost-cutting phases followed by crisis management phases, followed by hiring phases, followed by cost-cutting phases. The accounting department, which would be inheriting oversight of the Meridian project, seemed confident in their ability to handle the transition. Janet Mills, the accounting manager, assured me that they had been monitoring the project's financial performance throughout the implementation process. The vendor payments were being processed on schedule, and the project appeared to be proceeding according to plan. I didn't share my concerns about the underlying cost structure. Those concerns had already been documented and dismissed. My role now was to ensure a smooth transition, not to continue advocating for positions that had been deemed inappropriate for my level of authority. But I did make sure that my analysis was properly preserved and accessible. The documentation was archived in the company's central repository, with copies distributed to all relevant stakeholders. The accounting department received a complete set of my research, including the alternative vendor proposals and cost-benefit analyses. Everything was properly labeled and organized for easy reference. The first week of my transition period passed quietly. I completed my outstanding analysis work, prepared detailed handover documents, and attended the necessary meetings to ensure continuity of operations. The company's interests were being protected, just as they should be. During this period, I also began preparing for my job search. The severance package would provide some financial cushion, but I needed to be strategic about my next career move. The risk assessment field was competitive, and I wanted to position myself effectively for the right opportunity. Part of this preparation involved organizing my professional portfolio. Any competent risk assessment professional maintains a comprehensive record of their work, both for job search purposes and for potential professional references. My portfolio included anonymized case studies, examples of successful risk mitigation strategies, and documentation of cost savings achieved through effective analysis. The Meridian Project case study would be particularly valuable for my portfolio. It demonstrated my ability to identify significant financial risks and develop comprehensive mitigation strategies. The fact that the company had chosen not to implement my recommendations didn't diminish the quality of the analysis. If anything, it made the case study more interesting from a professional development perspective. I was careful to ensure that my portfolio materials contained no proprietary information or confidential data. All company-specific details were removed or anonymized. The focus was on methodology, analytical approach, and professional competence. Standard practice for any professional seeking to demonstrate their capabilities to potential employers. The second week of my transition period brought an unexpected development. On Thursday morning, Sarah Chen mentioned that she had been hearing rumors about problems with the Meridian Project implementation. The rumors were vague, but they suggested that Apex Solutions was encountering difficulties with the software deployment. I expressed appropriate concern, but reminded Sarah that the project was no longer my responsibility. The accounting department was handling oversight, and I was sure they would address any issues that arose. My role now was to complete my transition duties and ensure that my departure didn't create any unnecessary complications. But I was curious about the nature of the problems. Professional curiosity, nothing more. The Meridian Project had been a significant focus of my work, and I had developed a thorough understanding of its technical and financial complexity. Understanding what was going wrong might provide valuable insights for future projects. The rumors became more specific over the following days. Apex Solutions had apparently encountered compatibility issues with the company's existing systems. The software integration was taking longer than expected, and additional development work was required. This additional work would, of course, require additional payments beyond the already inflated contract amount. Janet Mills from accounting seemed confident that the situation was manageable. Apex had provided a detailed explanation of the technical challenges, along with a revised timeline and budget for completion. The additional costs were regrettable, but not unprecedented for projects of this complexity. I reviewed the technical documentation that Apex had provided. Their explanation of the compatibility issues seemed plausible, but I noticed several inconsistencies in their proposed solutions. The additional development work they were requesting would address symptoms rather than underlying problems. It was expensive Band-Aid medicine that would likely require further expensive Band-Aids in the future. More concerning was the timeline for completion. Apex was requesting an additional 6 months for full deployment, which would push the project well beyond its original completion date. The delay would have significant operational impacts, affecting multiple departments and potentially compromising the company's ability to meet year-end financial reporting requirements. I documented these concerns in a brief memorandum, which I provided to Janet Mills as part of my transition responsibilities. The memo was factual and professional, focusing on technical and financial implications rather than making recommendations. My authority to make recommendations had been terminated along with my employment. The memorandum was well received by the accounting department. Janet thanked me for the additional context and assured me that they would consider my observations as they evaluated Apex's revised proposal. The company's interests were being protected, which was all that mattered. My last day with the company was a Friday, standard practice for departing employees. I cleaned out my office, returned my equipment, and attended the usual goodbye meetings with colleagues and supervisors. Harrison was gracious in his farewell comments, emphasizing my contributions to the company and wishing me success in my future endeavors. The severance agreement was finalized that afternoon. 3 months' salary, continued health insurance coverage, and a positive reference letter that highlighted my analytical skills and attention to detail. The company had handled my departure professionally, with all appropriate courtesies and considerations. I spent the weekend organizing my home office and preparing for the job search process. The severance package would provide financial stability while I looked for the right opportunity. I had several potential leads already, and I was confident that my experience and qualifications would translate into attractive offers. Monday morning brought an interesting phone call. Marcus Torres from my former company wanted to discuss the Meridian project. Apex Solutions had submitted their revised proposal, and the additional costs were more significant than initially indicated. The total project cost would now exceed $2.4 million, more than double the original budget. Janet Mills and the accounting department were concerned about the financial implications. They had reviewed my memorandum and wanted to understand my analysis in greater detail. Would I be willing to provide additional consultation on the project, perhaps on a freelance basis? I explained that my understanding of the project was based on research that I had conducted as part of my regular duties. The documentation was comprehensive and should provide all the context necessary for informed decision-making. If they needed additional analysis, they should consider engaging a qualified consultant who could provide independent assessment. Marcus pressed for more information. The accounting department was struggling to understand the technical complexities that Apex was citing as justification for the additional costs. They needed someone with my level of expertise to evaluate the vendor's claims and determine whether the proposed solutions were appropriate. I suggested that they might want to consider engaging one of the alternative vendors that I had identified in my original analysis. Data Core Systems or Meridian Technologies would be well-positioned to provide independent assessment of Apex's technical difficulties. They might even be able to propose more cost-effective solutions. The conversation ended with Marcus asking if I would be available for a brief consultation meeting. The company would be willing to pay my normal consulting rate for a few hours of technical review. They simply needed someone with sufficient expertise to evaluate Apex's claims and determine the most appropriate response. I agreed to consider the request and asked for written details about the specific consultation they were seeking. Any consulting arrangement would need to be properly documented and compensated at market rates. I had no interest in providing free advice to the company that had just terminated my employment. The written request arrived the following day. The company was seeking an independent technical assessment of Apex Solutions' revised proposal. They wanted to understand whether the additional costs were justified and whether alternative approaches might be more cost-effective. The consultation would be limited to technical analysis, with no expectation of ongoing involvement in project management. The proposed compensation was reasonable, $300 per hour for up to 20 hours of analysis work. The company would provide all necessary documentation and would expect a written report within 2 weeks of the engagement start date. I accepted the consulting arrangement. The work would be straightforward, and the compensation would help offset the income gap during my job search. More importantly, it would provide an opportunity to demonstrate my expertise to a broader audience within the company. The consultation began the following Monday. The accounting department provided complete documentation of Apex's revised proposal, including technical specifications, timeline estimates, and cost breakdowns. They also provided access to the original project files and my previous analysis work. Reviewing the materials, I quickly identified several significant problems with Apex approach. The compatibility issues they were citing were real, but not insurmountable. The additional development work they were proposing was expensive and unnecessarily complex. A more straightforward solution would address the underlying problems at a fraction of the cost. I also noticed that Apex had failed to implement several of the cost-saving measures that I had recommended in my original analysis. The licensing agreement still included services that the company would never use. The consultant fees had continued to escalate beyond reasonable bounds. The vendor was essentially being paid to fix problems that could have been avoided with proper planning. The alternative vendors that I had identified in my original analysis were still available and still interested in the project. Data Core Systems confirmed that they could complete the implementation for approximately $800,000, less than half of Apex's revised budget. Meridian Technologies provided a similar estimate, with the additional benefit of faster deployment and better integration with existing systems. My consulting report was comprehensive but focused. I documented the technical problems with Apex's current approach, outlined the cost implications of their proposed solutions, and provided detailed comparisons with alternative options. The potential savings were substantial, and the technical risks were significantly lower. The report was well received by the accounting department. Janet Mills scheduled a meeting to discuss the findings and determine next steps. The company's executive team would need to decide whether to continue with Apex or transition to an alternative vendor. 3 days later, Harrison called me personally. The executive team had reviewed my consulting report and wanted to discuss the recommendations in greater detail. Would I be available for a meeting that afternoon? The meeting was held in the same conference room where I had presented my original analysis of the Meridian project. Harrison was there, along with Janet Mills, Marcus Torres, and 2 vice presidents from the operations and finance departments. The atmosphere was notably different from our previous interactions. Harrison began by acknowledging that the company had made some errors in its initial evaluation of the Meridian project. The costs had escalated beyond acceptable levels, and the technical problems were more serious than initially understood. They needed to make significant corrections to ensure the project's success. The consulting report had provided valuable insights into the underlying issues. The alternative vendors that I had identified offered compelling solutions at significantly lower costs. The company was prepared to terminate its relationship with Apex Solutions and transition to one of these alternatives. But they needed someone with sufficient expertise to manage the transition. The accounting department could handle the financial aspects, but they lacked the technical knowledge necessary to ensure smooth implementation. They needed a project manager who understood both the technical and financial complexities involved. Harrison asked if I would be interested in returning to the company as a consultant for the duration of the project. The role would be temporary, focused specifically on managing the vendor transition and ensuring successful implementation. The compensation would be significantly higher than my previous salary, reflecting the specialized nature of the work. I asked for time to consider the offer. The opportunity was attractive, but I wanted to ensure that the working relationship would be properly structured. Clear expectations, defined deliverables, and appropriate decision-making authority would be essential for success. The formal offer arrived 2 days later. 6-month consulting contract, renewable at mutual agreement. Compensation of $150,000 plus expenses, nearly double my previous annual salary. Full authority over vendor selection and implementation management, with reporting directly to the executive team rather than through the normal departmental hierarchy. I accepted the offer with appropriate professional enthusiasm. The contract was signed the following week, and I returned to the company as an independent consultant specializing in risk assessment and project management. The first order of business was terminating the relationship with Apex Solutions. The legal department handled the contract cancellation, which involved some financial penalties but far less than the cost of continuing with their overpriced and inadequate services. Apex was not pleased with the decision, but they had no legal recourse to force continuation of the relationship. DataCore Systems was selected as the replacement vendor after a competitive bidding process. Their proposal was technically sound, reasonably priced, and included performance guarantees that Apex had never offered. The transition was managed carefully to minimize disruption to ongoing operations. The implementation proceeded smoothly. DataCore's team was professional and competent, with none of the attitude problems that had characterized Apex's approach. They delivered on schedule and within budget, with no surprise costs or technical difficulties. The final project cost was $847,000, less than half of what Apex had been requesting for their revised proposal. The savings exceeded $1.2 million compared to the original trajectory, and the technical performance was superior to what Apex had been promising. The project was completed successfully, with full deployment achieved 2 months ahead of the original schedule. The software integration was seamless, and the operational benefits were immediately apparent. The company's year-end financial reporting was enhanced rather than compromised by the new systems. My consulting contract was renewed for an additional 6 months, with expanded responsibilities for risk assessment across multiple departments. The compensation was increased to reflect the broader scope of work, and the reporting relationship remained at the executive level. The renewal period was equally successful. I identified several additional cost-saving opportunities and helped implement risk management protocols that prevented future vendor relationship problems. The company's financial performance improved measurably, and the risk assessment function was elevated to a more strategic role. When the consulting contract concluded, I was offered a permanent position as Director of Risk Management. The role represented a significant promotion from my previous position, with salary and benefits that reflected the value of specialized expertise. The reporting relationship would remain at the executive level, ensuring appropriate authority and influence. I declined the permanent position. The consulting work had provided valuable experience and financial compensation, but I had received several attractive offers from other organizations. The job market for experienced risk assessment professionals was robust, and I wanted to explore opportunities that would provide new challenges and growth potential. Harrison seemed genuinely disappointed by my decision. He acknowledged that the company had made significant errors in its previous evaluation of my work. The termination of my original position had been a mistake, based on incomplete understanding of the project's technical and financial complexities. The company had learned valuable lessons about the importance of specialized expertise and the risks of cost-cutting measures that compromised analytical capability. They would be restructuring their risk assessment function to ensure that similar mistakes were not repeated in the future. My final day as a consultant was marked by a different kind of farewell meeting. The executive team gathered to express their appreciation for my contributions to the company's success. The Meridian project had been transformed from a potential disaster into a significant achievement, and my role in that transformation was explicitly acknowledged. Harrison presented me with a letter of recommendation that would be valuable for future opportunities. The letter emphasized my technical expertise, analytical rigor, and ability to identify and resolve complex financial problems. It also noted my professionalism in handling difficult circumstances and my commitment to the company's best interests. The letter concluded with a statement that I found particularly satisfying. Harrison wrote that my analysis of the Meridian project had demonstrated exactly the kind of thoroughness and expertise that the company valued most highly. My willingness to identify uncomfortable truths and propose difficult solutions was precisely the characteristic that distinguished exceptional professionals from merely competent ones. I kept a copy of that letter, along with the documentation of the project's successful completion and the financial savings that had been achieved. The materials would be valuable for my professional portfolio, but they represented something more important than career advancement opportunities. They represented vindication of a professional approach that prioritizes accuracy over convenience, thoroughness over expedience, and long-term value over short-term cost savings. The company had learned that expertise is not a luxury to be eliminated during efficiency initiatives, but a necessity to be preserved and respected. The job search process that followed was remarkably smooth. My experience with the Meridian project provided compelling evidence of my ability to identify significant financial risks and develop effective mitigation strategies. The successful resolution of the vendor relationship problems demonstrated my capability to manage complex technical and financial challenges. I received multiple offers from organizations that valued analytical expertise and were willing to compensate it appropriately. The position I ultimately accepted was with a Fortune 500 company that had been seeking someone with my specific combination of risk assessment experience and project management skills. The new role came with a significant salary increase and expanded responsibilities. I would be leading a team of analysts and working directly with senior management on strategic risk assessment initiatives. The company's commitment to thorough analysis and evidence-based decision-making was explicit and genuine. 6 months into my new position, I received a call from Marcus Torres. The company had encountered another vendor relationship problem, this time with their facilities management contractor. The situation was similar to the Meridian project, with escalating costs and questionable performance. Would I be interested in providing consulting services to help resolve the problem? I declined the consulting opportunity but provided some general advice about the importance of thorough vendor evaluation and the risks of accepting contractor explanations without independent verification. The company had the resources and expertise to handle the situation internally, and they had learned valuable lessons from the Meridian project experience. Marcus mentioned that the company's new risk assessment team was performing well, but that they missed the level of expertise and analytical rigor that I had provided. The department had been expanded and was now considered a critical component of the company's strategic planning process. The conversation reminded me that professional vindication takes many forms. Sometimes it comes through dramatic confrontations and immediate recognition of superior performance. More often, it comes through the quiet satisfaction of work well done and the gradual recognition of value that was previously underappreciated. The Meridian project had provided both forms of vindication. The immediate recognition came through the successful resolution of the vendor relationship problems and the substantial cost savings that were achieved. The gradual recognition came through the company's acknowledgement that they had made serious errors in their initial evaluation of my work. But the most meaningful vindication was personal. I had maintained my professional standards and analytical integrity despite institutional pressure to accept inadequate solutions. I had documented my work thoroughly and preserved the evidence that ultimately proved my assessments correct. I had responded to professional setbacks with strategic thinking rather than emotional reactions. The experience reinforced several important principles about professional practice in complex organizations. Expertise is valuable but not always valued. Thorough analysis can be perceived as overstepping authority by managers who prefer convenient answers to accurate ones. Documentation is essential for protecting both professional interests and organizational resources. Most importantly, the experience demonstrated that professional vindication requires patience, preparation, and persistence. Organizations that dismiss expertise often discover their mistake eventually, but the discovery process can be expensive and painful. Professionals who maintain their standards and preserve their work create opportunities for eventual recognition and redemption. The Meridian project cost the company approximately $400,000 in unnecessary expenses, vendor cancellation penalties, and project delays. But the ultimate cost of dismissing expertise was much higher. The company lost a valuable employee, damaged its reputation with qualified professionals, and created an institutional culture that prioritized short-term cost savings over long-term value. The financial savings achieved through proper vendor management were substantial, but the real value was in the lessons learned about the importance of respecting and preserving analytical capability. Organizations that treat expertise as a luxury rather than a necessity inevitably discover that luxury becomes necessity when problems become crises. Looking back on the experience, I recognize that professional vindication is not about proving others wrong, but about proving that professional standards matter. The goal is not to embarrass those who make poor decisions, but to demonstrate that better decisions are possible when expertise is properly valued and utilized. The Meridian project provided a perfect case study in the costs of organizational short-sightedness and the benefits of analytical rigor. The documentation of that case study has been valuable for my career advancement, but it has also been valuable for the broader profession of risk assessment. The experience has made me a better professional and a more effective advocate for the importance of thorough analysis in organizational decision-making. It has also made me more selective about the organizations I choose to work with and more careful about documenting my work and preserving evidence of professional competence. Professional vindication is deeply satisfying, but it is also deeply personal. It represents the triumph of professional values over institutional expedience, of analytical rigor over convenient assumptions, of long-term thinking over short-term pressures. The satisfaction comes not from the recognition of superior performance, but from the knowledge that professional standards were maintained despite institutional pressure to compromise them. The vindication comes not from the admission of others' mistakes, but from the demonstration that those mistakes were avoidable and that better alternatives were available. The Meridian project taught me that professional expertise is simultaneously fragile and resilient. It can be dismissed by organizational decision-makers who undervalue its importance, but it cannot be eliminated by institutional politics or cost-cutting measures. Expertise persists, and eventually its value becomes apparent to those who have the wisdom to recognize it. The experience also taught me that professional vindication is not a destination, but a process. It requires continuous commitment to excellence, careful documentation of work, and strategic thinking about how to position expertise for maximum organizational benefit. It requires the patience to wait for recognition and the persistence to maintain standards despite temporary setbacks. Most importantly, the experience taught me that professional vindication is not about proving individual superiority, but about demonstrating the value of professional standards and analytical rigor. The goal is not personal triumph, but institutional improvement. Not individual recognition, but organizational learning. The Meridian project represents a successful example of professional vindication, but it also represents a cautionary tale about the costs of organizational short-sightedness. Companies that dismiss expertise often discover their mistake, but the discovery process can be expensive and painful for all involved. The lesson for professionals is clear. Maintain your standards, document your work, and be patient. Organizations that value expertise will recognize it eventually, and those that don't will create opportunities for those who do. Professional vindication is not guaranteed, but it is possible for those who are prepared to work for it. The lesson for organizations is equally clear. Expertise is not a luxury to be eliminated during cost-cutting initiatives, but a necessity to be preserved and respected. The short-term savings achieved by dismissing analytical capability are often overwhelmed by the long-term costs of poor decision-making and missed opportunities. Professional vindication is deeply satisfying, but it is also deeply instructive. It teaches valuable lessons about the importance of professional standards, the value of analytical rigor, and the necessity of maintaining expertise in complex organizational environments. These lessons benefit not only individual professionals, but the organizations that are wise enough to learn from them.